This is not an actual history textbook. The Ottoman Empire never looked like this in 1920. Rather, the map is set in an alternate history scenario, in which the Ottomans never collapsed. The knock-on effects are enormous. A very different First World War, no Armenian genocide, and an unrecognisable Middle East. In the background, you'll find a sped-up time-lapse of me working on the map you've just seen. I hope you don't mind how quickly it's going, but there was simply a lot of footage to go through. Over 2 hours worth, in fact. But anyway, let's talk a bit more about what the map itself represents, and the timeline it's set in. We'll go over the background first. The Ottoman Empire was, at its peak, an expansive realm stretching from the Balkans in the north to the Arabian Peninsula in the south, and from the Persian Gulf in the east to Algeria in the west. It was a Muslim monarchy, with the core ethnic group being the Turks, but it ruled over numerous different ethnic and religious groups. The larger unifying factor was the Ottoman dynasty, from which the country derives its name. From its origins as a petty kingdom in a corner of northwestern Anatolia in the 14th century, it grew to its maximum size in the 16th century, after which it mostly ceased expanding its territory. This is where I must address the so-called Ottoman decline thesis, which was a common opinion among historians of the 19th and 20th centuries and still persists today, albeit in a lesser form. The thesis states, basically, that after achieving its maximum territorial control in the 16th century, during the rule of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire fell into an unending decline that would persist until its very end in the early 20th century. At the surface, the thesis may seem true, because the empire did generally cease expanding its domain by war after that time, but we absolutely cannot say that it experienced a decline in all matters of government. That is, instead of actively expanding by war, the Ottoman state gradually shifted towards greater centralization and control of the land it already controlled. The state became more focused on extracting revenue from its land, while also expanding its cultural and religious standing, especially by the claiming of the caliphate by the Ottoman dynasty. This is basically the modern academic consensus of the matter, which disagrees with the popular decline thesis. Now, having gotten that out of the way, let's skip ahead to the 19th century. At this point, the empire was truly falling behind European powers in several areas, mostly in the military department. It had fought several wars with Russia, mostly with mixed success, while the birth of nationalism began threatening its European possessions. This is when the Tanzimat era begins. Tanzimat, in Ottoman Turkish, literally means reorganization, and it was indeed, as the name would suggest, a period of reforms meant to modernize and strengthen the now ailing Ottoman Empire, and bring it up to par with the other great powers of Europe. It's also around this time that the label Sick Man of Europe gains popularity, though it was rarely used by the Ottomans themselves. The Tanzimat era began in 1839 and ended with the first constitutional era in 1876, lasting just under 40 years. Overall, the reforms brought about by the Tanzimat had a mixed impact. On one hand, the initial opposition to the adoption of European cultural and legal norms had almost completely faded away by the end of it. Islamist scholars began referencing European philosophers and scientists to support their viewpoint, as did the more secular opposition. Thus, we can confidently say that by the end of the Tanzimat, there was no longer any significant struggle between the so-called modernizers, who sought to adopt customs from Europe, and reactionaries, who sought to oppose that adoption. However, there still remained the age-old struggle between the centre of the empire in Constantinople and the periphery. Actually, the growth of nationalism only made the struggle even more vigorous, because it just so happens that most of the periphery of the Ottoman state was populated by ethnic minorities. In the case of the European provinces, not even a common faith could bind the Christian Bulgarians, Serbs, and Greeks to the empire. Even worse, the great powers of Europe were now increasingly interested in expanding their influence in the Balkans without technically upsetting the balance of power by actually conquering territory from the Ottomans. Instead, they pushed for peripheral regions of the state to become more and more autonomous, thus remaining under Ottoman sovereignty in name only. Many intellectuals believed the Tanzimat reforms didn't go far enough, supporting the formation of a constitution to make the empire more similar to other European monarchies like Belgium or Prussia, where the power of the king was limited by the constitution. They formed a secret society known as the Young Ottomans, which is not to be confused with the Young Turks, which grew to include prominent members of the state apparatus and military. In 1876, the Young Ottomans, headed by the Grand Vizier, Midhat Pasha, organized a bloodless coup which overthrew the old sultan and put in his place the young Murad V, who became the new sultan. This is where our divergence begins. In our timeline, which I'll just abbreviate to OTL from now on, Murad V had some rather serious health issues, which were only made worse after his uncle, the old sultan, committed suicide after being removed from the throne. He suffered from alcoholism and acted bizarrely, unbefitting of the sultan, despite some doctors stating that his condition was improving and that he could be cured. He himself was quickly deposed in favour of his half-brother, Abdulhamid II. In OTL, Abdulhamid II at first supported the Young Ottomans' goal of promulgating a constitution, but after the disastrous Russo-Ottoman War of 1877 to 1878, he quickly switched his position and became an autocratic ruler, suspending the constitution and thus ending the first constitutional era. In the alternate timeline, however, Murad V is just healthy enough that he isn't deposed in favour of Abdulhamid II. He is a very weak sultan, however, and this allows the Young Ottomans to force a constitution that is much more restrictive of the sultan's power. Midhat Pasha comes to rule behind the scenes, while Murad V remains effectively a figurehead. The new and more competent government, understirred by a double change of power, fares better in the war against Russia. The Ottoman forces valiantly battle the Russian troops and manage to halt them from occupying Bulgaria, but are nevertheless forced to sue for peace. The war is undoubtedly a defeat, but not a catastrophic one. In particular, the British, encouraged by the signs of liberal reform in the empire, apply more pressure on the Russians in the ensuing peace talks, producing a peace treaty like this. Romania, Serbia and Montenegro gain independence. Kars and Batumi are annexed by Russia. Thessaly and Arta is annexed by Greece, while Bosnia is annexed by Austria. But, crucially, Bulgaria and Cyprus remain in Ottoman possession, unlike in our timeline. The war is still a terrible blow to the Ottoman state. Opposition to the new liberal order rises, with several mutinies in the army and an attempted coup by Abdulhamid II. But the liberals managed to hold on to power. In particular, despite the defeat in the war as a result of the old oppressive policies, which alienated many national minorities in the Balkans and made them rise up to support the Russians. The Constitution of 1877 cannot be blamed for defeat in the war, because it had only been written a few short months before its beginning. In fact, Midhat Pasha manages to seize this post-war chaos as an opportunity to push for even greater reform, lest such disaster be repeated once again. Without the loss of Bulgaria and Cyprus, the Ottoman position in Europe is much more secure than it was in our timeline. There is no talk of moving the capital further inland away from Europe, and it remains securely in Constantinople. The state proceeds with a second round of reform, more vigorous than the last. In particular, the economic situation is made better than it was in OTL, partly because the weak sultan is prevented from spending lavishly on palace construction and maintenance, while the government seeks to monetize and rationalize the economy. A better relationship with the British secures a reduction in the enormous debt the state has accrued, along with lower interest rates. The state is much more democratic without suspension of the constitution, contrary to the reactionary opposition's thoughts. Enabling minorities to vote on the same terms as everyone else does not support separatism, but rather the opposite. A violent, revolutionary national movement is partially channeled into reformist democratic movement instead. Ottomanism as a civic identity rather than Turkism grows as an ideology of the state. Wealthy Armenians and Albanians, especially the merchants, become the foundation of this new and liberal Ottomanist government. As a consequence, the Young Turk movement, represented chiefly by the Committee of Union and Progress, or CUP, never gains much traction, unlike in our timeline. In effect, the Ottoman state now has a period of prolonged stability, well, relative stability I should say, where the European rules of balance of power prevent more large-scale wars, while the government is free to pursue reform. The Balkan Wars do not occur either. Without a strong, independent Bulgaria, the other Balkan states do not dare poke the Ottoman bear. This delays the almost inevitable start of the Great War by a few years. The Ottomans continued to search for allies among the great powers to protect them from Russia in the future, but to no avail. This period of reform and gradual growth continues up until the start of the Great War in 1916. With a more developed economy and a relatively stable internal situation, the Ottomans lean much more heavily into supporting armed neutrality rather than desperately clutching onto the only ally they could get, as happened in our timeline. Even more, the better relations with the British prevents any embarrassing diplomatic scandals, such as the seizure of Ottoman warships, and disinclines the Ottomans from fighting with them. Russia is an existential threat, sure, but at this point the Ottoman state has seen the Japanese beat the Russians in 1905, followed by a revolution in the very heart of Russia in St. Petersburg. Finally, without the loss of Bulgaria and Cyprus, revanchism sentiment is kept at a minimum. In short, the Ottomans have numerous reasons for staying out of the European conflict, and very few for joining it. Staying neutral while the other great powers are absolutely slugging it out, the Ottomans make a huge profit by renegotiating the debt and selling raw materials needed for war. Without the radical Turkist agenda of the Committee of Union and Progress and wartime pressure in the region, the Armenian genocide never occurs. Better yet for the state, two of its main rivals collapse after the war's end, Austria and Russia. The former lost the war, and thus the pressures of nationalism, which had been building up for decades, finally results in the state splintering into many nation-states, none of which pose a threat individually to the Ottoman state. Russia, too, undergoes a brutal civil war, which weakens it for years to come. In fact, the Ottomans seized this opportunity to retake the territories lost previously, reconquering Batumi and Kars, while the Reds and Whites are too busy to care, while the Georgians and Armenians are too weak to offer any serious resistance. Of course, nothing is perfect. The Ottoman state is rocked by a revolution of the Bulgarians in 1919. Having seen the success of the Czechs, Slovaks, Croatians, and so on in obtaining independence from Austria, the Bulgarians strike as well. Following a brief few weeks of fighting, the Ottoman state grants independence to the Bulgarians, but manages to hold on to the southern part of what Bulgaria had claimed, protecting Constantinople. Thus, by 1920, the Ottomans are one of the sole surviving empires of the old style. They possess a reasonably developed economy, a well-established democratic process, and huge oil deposits. The greatest threat now is the rise of Arab nationalism, which had until this point been delayed by how isolated and rural many of the Arab regions were. And that's where I cut the law. The butterfly effects were, by this point, getting massive, so I'll leave it as an exercise to you, the viewer, to tell me what the most plausible future for this reformed Ottoman state is. Does it succumb to Arab nationalism, become a little more than a slightly greater Turkey? Or does the oil boom make it so fabulously wealthy that it can simply buy off the Arabs? What about the Second World War? Decolonization? Communism? I don't know. But if you do, then share your thoughts in the comments below. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed the footage of me making this map. As you can see, the final product is slightly different to what you saw in the time-lapse, but I just cut some of the final parts of rearranging the map to make it look like a textbook. If you have any ideas or suggestions on new scenarios and maps to make, please write them in the comments below. I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video as well. And thank you for watching.